He spots the emaciated Bobcat sprawled on his porch, her hollow eyes locked on him in silent desperation. In the next heartbeat, he chooses a risky action that may save her or ruin them both. High in the rolling hills of Willow Creek County, an early autumn wind swept across acres of farmland, carrying the sense of harvest and hinting at the winter soon to come. The morning sun, just peeking over the distant ridge, cast a golden light that stretched across a landscape dotted with silos and tractor sheds. In this quiet corner of the countryside, life was simple, but by no means easy. For as long as anyone could remember, the fields had provided wheat and corn, and the wooded edges teemed with wildlife, from gentle deer to wary coyotes. But on this particular morning, something far more unexpected unfolded at the threshold of a modest, time-worn farmhouse. 70-year-old Hank Morrison was already awake when the first rays touched his property. He lived alone now, ever since his wife passed away 3 years earlier. Their children had grown and moved on to busier places, leaving Hank to tend the last of the farmland on his own. He wore age like a comfortable coat, lines of hard work on his face, calloused hands from decades of labor, and a certain calmness that only came from tending animals and crops through all seasons. He considered himself prepared for most challenges. He was used to sudden storms that could tear through a harvest, or the occasional stray dog chasing the livestock. Yet nothing in his decades of farming had prepared him for the sight that awaited him on his porch just before sunrise. Hank had stepped out to gather the morning paper and check the cloud cover, hoping to know if a cold front might roll in later. That was when he noticed a lump of mottled fur sprawled right by the porch steps. At first, he assumed it was an injured raccoon or maybe a possum. But as he approached, he realized it was something much more dangerous and far more vulnerable. A bobcat, its normally tawny coat dulled by grime and its ribs showing starkly against its sunken sides, lay unmoving. Even in that emaciated state, the cat was easily 2 feet long from nose to tail, its tufted ears pointing weakly upward. For a moment, Hank felt his heart thud with alarm. A bobcat was no gentle barn cat. He'd encountered wild felines before, prowling at the edges of fields in search of rabbits. They rarely came close to human dwellings, yet here one was, collapsed on his porch, too exhausted even to flinch as he stood over it. The cat's breathing was shallow, and when Hank knelt to get a better look, he saw that her eyes, an unmistakable shade of pale gold, were half closed, as if she were on the brink of giving up entirely. He took a careful step back, measuring the risk. Wild animals could lash out if cornered, and a bobcat's claws could do real damage. But Hank also knew what it meant to be desperate. He'd seen calves born in winter storms that should have ended their lives, yet survived thanks to a bit of warmth and care. He recognized that same spark in the bobcat's shallow breaths, an animal lingering at the edge of life, clinging to hope despite the odds. For a moment he stood in indecision. Call the local wildlife agency, or at least let someone know there was a wild predator on his porch. Common sense told him that was the proper route. But something about the creature's broken condition and quiet resignation tugged at him. Hank slipped inside and grabbed a thick pair of welding gloves, an old blanket, and the sturdiest cardboard box he could find. He had no illusions about this being safe. A bobcat, even half dead, could be dangerous if startled. Still, letting it stay out in the open, exposed to the chill and too weak to defend itself, seemed wrong. With gentle, deliberate moves, he approached and spoke in a low, calming voice, though he doubted the cat understood a word. When he wrapped the blanket around her bony body, the only reaction was a faint hiss, more a reflex than a real threat. Slowly, he lifted her into the box. The bobcat's head lolled to one side, and Hank's concern deepened. She truly was on her last leg. He carried the box inside, unsure if he was walking into a fool's errand or an inevitable heartbreak. Then again, farmers often found themselves caring for fragile lives, be they calves, chicks, or fawns, separated from their mothers. If there was even a chance he could keep the creature from dying on his porch, he was willing to try. He cleared a corner in his mudroom, placed the box near a space heater, and draped another blanket over the top for warmth. The bobcat made no move to escape, which only underscored her dire condition. All the while, Hank's mind churned with questions. How had she ended up here? Had she been wounded? Had something happened to her prey supply? He filled a shallow bowl with water and placed it within reach. The cat didn't stir. Alarmed, he gently nudged the fur along her flank and felt the slow rise and fall of her labored breathing. She was still alive, but for how long? He removed his gloves and stepped back to make the call he knew he should have made from the start. The number for the county's Fish and Wildlife Office was tacked above the phone. Hank hesitated, the phone in his hand. He could already imagine the response. They'd either send someone to remove the cat or advise him to leave her outside for nature to take its course. Official protocol often leaned toward letting wild predators remain wild or euthanizing them if they were too far gone. Yet Hank wasn't quite ready to hand this over. Maybe he was too soft-hearted for his own good, but he wanted to see if she could survive with a bit of help. Setting the phone down, he decided on a temporary compromise. He'd call a trusted friend who happened to work at a nearby wildlife rehabilitation center, but only after he did what he could to stabilize the bobcat. He rummaged through his kitchen, searching for anything that might entice an emaciated carnivore. A can of tuna seemed the best start. Gently, he spooned some onto a small plate and inched it close to her nose. There was no immediate reaction. The cat's whiskers didn't even twitch. Hank sighed, wiping his brow. He wondered if he was already too late. He recalled a time when a half-frozen barn cat, just a regular house cat that had wandered onto his property, pulled through after he kept it warm and fed it by hand. That memory fueled his next idea. He pulled on the welding gloves again, carefully pried the bobcat's mouth open, and slipped a few morsels of tuna inside before gently massaging her throat. It was risky, but she was too weak to resist. After the second attempt, he felt the muscles in her throat move as she swallowed a tiny piece. It was a start, though heartbreakingly small. For the next hour, he repeated the process, coaxing little bits of food and water into her. By the time he stopped, the sun was well over the horizon, lighting the yellowing fields and making the old farmhouse windows glow. Worn out from the adrenaline of handling a wild animal, Hank sank into a chair at the kitchen table. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the mudroom, half expecting the bobcat to rally and lunge. But all was still, save for the hum of the space heater. In the quiet, he realized how invested he already was. Could she pull through? And if she did, what then? He didn't imagine she would show any gratitude. It wasn't in a bobcat's nature. He wasn't even sure he'd make it through the night without a well-placed claw to his arm. But as he stared at his trembling hands, he also felt a sense of purpose rising within him. Yes, this was a gamble. Yes, he was out of his depth, but this creature had collapsed on his porch for a reason, and for now, that reason was him. Hank's first phone call went to Laura Johnson, a retired veterinarian who volunteered at a small wildlife rehabilitation nonprofit. They'd known each other for decades, ever since Laura had treated one of Hank's heifers for a nasty hoof infection one stormy spring. Over the years, she'd become his go-to whenever he stumbled upon an orphaned fawn or a snake trapped in the silo. When Laura picked up, Hank explained, voice low and urgent, exactly what was nestled in his mudroom. She took in every detail, occasionally interrupting with pointed questions. "So she's breathing, but real shallow?" Laura asked. "Yes, ma'am," Hank answered, eyes drifting to the mudroom door. "I managed to get a little water and some tuna down her throat. She's so thin, I can feel every rib." Laura's tone softened. "You did the right thing calling me. I'll head out with some supplies, but Hank, a bobcat is a protected species. We'll need to contact Fish and Wildlife eventually. For now, I'll see what we can do to help her." Hank hung up, feeling a mixture of relief and worry. He trusted Laura's experience, yet he knew the official stance on wild predators in poor condition was rarely simple. In many cases, wildlife officers preferred to let nature run its course. Sometimes, that meant euthanizing an animal too weak to be rehabilitated. Hank's mind wandered to the bobcat's half-lidded eyes, the faint rise and fall of her chest. Despite all rational thought, he hoped they could nurse her back to health, maybe even see her return to the wild. He cracked the mudroom door to check on her again. The space heater hummed quietly, sending warm air over the improvised nest he'd made. The cat hadn't moved from the spot where he'd gently placed her. Ears lay flat, and her paws were tucked in, as if clinging to the last vestiges of body heat. At least she was still breathing. Hank whispered a soft reassurance, though he wasn't sure why. He supposed it made him feel better to speak kindly, even if the bobcat had no comfort to draw from his voice. Before long, the growl of tires on gravel signaled Laura's arrival. She stepped out of her old truck, her short silver hair peeking from beneath a knitted cap. Slung over her shoulder was a battered leather bag stuffed with medical equipment and emergency rations. Hank opened the door, letting her pass through to the mudroom, where she knelt by the box. For a few moments, neither spoke. Laura gently laid a hand on the bobcat's flank, measuring respiration and heart rate the best she could without causing alarm. "She's in rough shape," Laura said, her brow furrowing. "Severely underweight. Could be starvation or maybe an illness that kept her from hunting." She checked the cat's gums. "Pale, but not the worst I've seen." "Is she gonna make it?" Hank asked, voice tight with concern. "I can't say yet. We'll try subcutaneous fluids first, see if that perks her up. If not, an IV might be needed, but that's risky without a proper exam table and sedation." Laura rummaged in her bag, pulling out a small syringe and a bag of fluids. Despite years of working with animals, Laura approached the bobcat with caution. Even near death, a cornered predator could lash out. Yet as she inserted the needle beneath the loose skin at the cat's shoulder, the bobcat only stirred once, emitting a faint, rasping sound that barely registered as a growl. Laura administered the fluids methodically, then withdrew. She placed a gentle hand on the cat's side, feeling for any abnormal lumps or injuries hidden beneath the thinning fur. "Don't see any obvious wounds," she noted, glancing at Hank. "Could be she's just starved. Might have been separated from her usual territory. A bad injury could have kept her from hunting, or maybe competition from a larger predator drove her away from easy prey." Hank nodded, absorbing the possibilities. "Should I call the wildlife folks now?" "Let's hold off for a bit," Laura answered. "If they come and see her in this condition, they might decide it's more humane to end things right away. I'd like to give her a chance. Let's see if she responds to the fluids. If she can stand or show signs of improvement in the next day, we can move her to the rehab center." That plan suited Hank fine. After Laura left, promising to return in the evening, Hank hovered around the mudroom, giving the cat space but checking in periodically. All day, he found himself glancing at the clock, wandering away from tasks he'd normally tackle without a second thought. The fields needed a final round of weeding before the weather turned cold, and the chicken coop could have used repairs, yet his mind stayed firmly inside the mudroom. Around noon, Hank brought in a shallow dish of homemade broth, warmed but not hot. He set it close to the bobcat's nose, hoping the scent might rouse her. She didn't move at first, and disappointment weighed heavy in his chest. Then, just as he turned away, he heard a soft, slurping sound. The cat's tongue flicked out to lap up a few drops. Hank paused, heart pounding with cautious hope, and then slowly knelt down for a better view. She took another tentative lick, then another, before exhaustion seemed to overwhelm her again. By mid-afternoon, the cat's breathing grew marginally steadier. Hank noticed a slight twitch in her tail whenever he entered the mudroom, a sign she was aware of his presence, if not fully alarmed by it. He still had no illusions about befriending a wild bobcat. Once she regained her strength, her instincts would dictate how she behaved. But for now, the quiet acceptance of his help felt like an odd truce. Late in the day, Laura returned. She brought a portable scale and a more specialized nutrient mix designed for carnivores. Hank watched as she repeated the fluid therapy and then attempted to feed the bobcat a small amount of the high-protein formula. This time, the cat swallowed more willingly, although she was far from robust. Laura took a measurement. 12 pounds, she announced grimly. A healthy adult female bobcat can weigh anywhere from 20 to 30. She's dangerously underweight. Hank's shoulders tensed. We'll keep trying. Laura gave him a thoughtful look. I won't lie, Hank. Her chances are 50-50 at best, but she's got a faint spark left. I've seen weaker animals pull through, Hank said, recalling scrawny calves that beat the odds. They set up a small pen arrangement in the mudroom to give the bobcat a bit more room without letting her roam freely. Night fell outside, stars filling the dark sky over the empty fields. With the house quiet, Hank sat in his armchair near the mudroom door, listening intently for any noise within. It was well after 9 when he heard soft rustling. He peeked inside to see the bobcat shifting positions, her ears more alert than before. She managed to raise her head, sniffing at the air with a careful flick of her nose. That small motion of curiosity lifted Hank's spirits. He knew better than to get ahead of himself. Wild creatures were notorious for sudden setbacks. But he felt a pull of optimism he hadn't experienced in a long time. Perhaps it was the solitude of his life, or the memory of losing his wife, that made him long to save something else from the brink of loss. He gently closed the door, leaving the bobcat to her rest, and trudged upstairs to bed. The next few days would be critical, a delicate dance between life and death in his humble mudroom. As he climbed under the covers, thoughts of the cat's half-lidded golden eyes filled his mind, along with a fervent hope that somewhere within that frail body a fierce will still burned. In the morning, he'd do whatever it took to fan that flame into a second chance at wild freedom. Dawn broke through a sheen of pale clouds the next morning, illuminating the farmland with a gentle, muted glow. Hank stirred from a restless sleep, his first thought not of the chores that needed tending, but of the bobcat in his mudroom. When he made his way downstairs, he paused at the closed door, bracing himself for what he might find. Part of him worried he would discover her lying motionless, that the small spark of hope he'd felt the night before had been snuffed out in the dark hours. He quietly opened the door and stepped inside. At first glance, the bobcat lay in the same corner, tail curled around her hind legs. Then her head twitched toward him. Her ears, though still flattened, weren't pinned quite as close to her skull as before. She didn't try to stand, but her eyes tracked his every movement. Hank noticed the empty broth dish had been nudged aside, bearing marks of a rough tongue. She must have licked it clean in the night. "Morning," he said softly, feeling a little foolish talking to a wild animal. Yet the bobcat made no threatening move, just a slow blink that revealed a glimmer of awareness. Hank gathered the empty dish and replaced it with fresh water. This time, he watched. The bobcat waited until he backed up a couple of steps. Then she angled her head forward, a taut, trembling motion, and drank a few small laps before collapsing back. It seemed to drain her strength, but it was progress nonetheless. Hank's heart lifted. Even these minute steps felt monumental. He went about his morning chores, feeding the chickens and checking the fences for damage. Usually, he'd relish the crisp air and the crow of the rooster echoing across the fields. Today, he hardly noticed. After scattering seed in the henhouse, he rushed back inside to see if the bobcat had stirred again. She had shifted a little more, her front paws stretched out. Her half-lidded gaze fell upon him as he approached. Though he kept his distance, he noticed her breathing, still labored but steadier. Remembering Laura's instructions, he decided it was best not to handle her unless necessary. He quickly heated some leftover broth and mixed in a small amount of the nutrient paste Laura had left behind. Once the aroma reached the bobcat, her nostrils flared, a sign that hunger was still present beneath her frailty. "Come on, girl," Hank murmured, inching the dish forward. He'd taken to calling her girl, though it was hardly a name in the affectionate sense, more a soft acknowledgement she was there and that he saw her as an individual, not just a wild menace. Cautiously, she leaned forward and began to lap at the mixture. Hank waited, holding his breath as though a single loud exhalation might spook her. When she'd had enough, she sank back with a faint groan, eyes drifting shut. He couldn't help but grin. It was the best she'd done yet, and Hank felt a flicker of pride in having guided her to this point. Next, he called Laura to share the news. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp with morning energy. "That's encouraging," she said when he told her about the bobcat drinking and eating on her own. "I'll come by late afternoon, see how she's doing. Keep it up, Hank, and remember, no sudden movements, no trying to pet her. She's still a wild predator." "I know," Hank replied, slightly defensive. "I've dealt with plenty of barn cats that didn't take kindly to human touch at first, but I'm not about to treat her like a stray kitten." After the call, he ate a quick breakfast, then took a mug of coffee outside to wander the porch. His gaze traveled to the spot where he'd found the bobcat collapsed less than a day ago. It struck him how close she'd been to dying on that faded porch step. He couldn't shake the feeling that if he hadn't found her at just that moment, she would have given up, curled into a final stillness. He sipped his coffee, letting gratitude and relief wash over him. Life on a farm had taught him that heartbreak could come swiftly, without warning. But today, at least, the tide seemed to be turning. By the time Laura arrived, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the yard, though the breeze carried a hint of chill. She parked her truck out back, same as before, and strode in with the confident steps of a professional who'd seen a bit of everything. Hank led her to the mudroom, where she conducted a second exam. This time, she brought a stethoscope and gently slipped it under the bobcat's side to listen. Despite the cat's obvious discomfort, she tolerated Laura's presence better than the day before, though she let out a weak hiss when Laura pressed too hard. "She's definitely improved," Laura said, setting the stethoscope aside. "Heart rate's a bit more stable, lungs aren't crackling. That's good." She turned to Hank. "She's not out of danger, but she's moving in the right direction." Hank exhaled a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "What's next?" Laura pursed her lips. "I'd like to keep her here one more day, then move her to the rehabilitation center if she keeps improving. I've got a secure enclosure there where she can rebuild her strength away from humans. We don't want her getting too used to people." The notion tugged at Hank's heart. He'd grown strangely attached to the sound of the bobcat breathing in the next room, the subtle signs of life that punctuated his quiet farmhouse. Still, he understood. A wild animal's best chance lay in an environment suited to its nature. "That makes sense," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "We also need to inform fish and wildlife," Laura added. "They might want to assess her condition themselves, check if she's been tagged. Sometimes researchers put collars on bobcats for population studies, though I don't see any sign of that. We'll handle it carefully. My guess is they'll be okay with rehab, provided she's genuinely able to recover." They checked her weight again, still painfully light, and gave another dose of fluids. The bobcat offered minimal resistance, a tiny twitch of her claws that didn't connect with flesh. Laura nodded approvingly. "That she has the energy to protest at all is a decent sign," she said with a grin. "She's fighting. I like that." By evening, The cat had lapped up more broth on her own, even crunching a few small pieces of soft food that Hank gently placed in the bowl. Each motion wore her out, but after she finished, she'd rest, then look around with slightly brighter eyes. Hank found himself speaking gently to her whenever he entered, a habit he'd picked up from years of calming nervous heifers in the birthing pen. He couldn't say if the bobcat understood or cared, but the soft murmur of his words felt like part of the healing process. He spent that night much like the previous one, dozing in his armchair, ear-tuned for any telltale sound from the mudroom. Around midnight, he heard movement, followed by a quiet chuff that might have been a cough or a low vocalization. He got up, peered inside, and caught a glimpse of the bobcat stretching her front legs in a languid, tremulous motion. Her coat, though dull, no longer seemed quite so ragged. He watched as she gingerly sniffed the space heater, the wariness in her posture, a testament that her wild instincts were intact. Hank allowed himself a small smile. She hadn't given in yet. Her spirit remained, though tested by hunger and exhaustion, and he felt an unexpected wave of admiration for her resilience. He slipped back out, careful to maintain the boundary she needed, heart brimming with guarded optimism. He wondered if, against all odds, this cat might fully mend, returning to the woods with the same fierce independence that had brought her to his porch in the first place. The next morning was crisp, with a faint frost glinting across the fields when Hank woke. He pulled on his boots and shuffled downstairs, half expecting to feel the same sense of dread that had haunted him in the early days of his wife's illness. But instead, a cautious sort of hope spurred him forward. Outside, the sunlight painted the porch in pale gold. Inside, the mudroom remained dark and still. He opened the door slowly, letting his eyes adjust. The bobcat was awake. She lifted her head when Hank entered, her ears now slightly perked. Though she didn't move from her patch of blankets, the alertness in her gaze told him her strength was inching back. He offered a soft greeting, then retrieved the bowl from the night before, noticing she had consumed most of the broth mixture. Encouraged, he prepared another serving and gently slid it toward her. This time, she began lapping at it almost immediately, pausing occasionally to rest, but then resuming with newfound determination. Hank felt his chest swell with relief. She was fighting, an unmistakable sign her will to live was intact. He left her to finish eating in peace, stepping out to the backyard and glancing toward the farthest field. The crops were in decent shape, though the coming cold months meant he'd soon be turning the soil for winter, leaving the land to rest. Usually, he found a comfortable rhythm in the seasonal cycle. This year, however, something felt different, more urgent. He wondered if he'd grown restless, or if perhaps the bobcat's presence was giving him a new sense of purpose. By mid-morning, Laura arrived once again, this time in the company of a younger woman wearing a khaki jacket embroidered with the state's Fish and Wildlife emblem. She introduced herself as Ranger Nicole Reyes, speaking in a direct professional tone. Hank felt a flicker of apprehension. Laura had mentioned the necessity of notifying wildlife authorities, but he still worried they might deem the bobcat too far gone, or too risky. Ranger Reyes nodded politely and asked a series of questions. How had Hank found the bobcat? What measures had been taken so far? Had there been any aggression? Hank answered each query, keeping his voice calm even as his anxiety simmered. Laura added her observations, emphasizing the cat's improvements over the last couple of days. Finally, Ranger Reyes asked to see her patient. They gathered in the mudroom, speaking in hushed tones as the bobcat lifted her head. Her eyes flickered to the newcomer, and her tail gave a tense twitch. Laura knelt, checking the cat's breathing and hydration levels, while Ranger Reyes observed from a few steps back. "She's definitely on the mend," Laura said, casting a glance at the ranger. "I think she's strong enough for transport now, Safer to do it before she's fully recovered and more likely to try escaping. Ranger Reyes folded her arms. So, you plan to move her to the rehabilitation center? That's the plan, Laura replied. Standard protocol for a wild carnivore in recovery. We'll monitor her closely and limit human interaction so she retains her natural instincts. Hank silently prayed that no one would suggest putting her down. His heart thudded as Ranger Reyes let out a slow exhale. That's acceptable, she said. We don't typically intervene with predators unless they become dangerous or too habituated to humans. But I see here an animal that was on the brink of starvation, not a nuisance cat. I'll file the paperwork so we can track her progress. If the center thinks she can be reintroduced to the wild, we'll cooperate. The relief Hank felt was overwhelming, washing over him in a wave. He managed a small smile, stepping forward. Thank you, he said softly, unable to hide the emotion in his voice. By noon, they agreed on a plan to sedate the Bobcat just enough to transport her safely. Laura prepared a mild tranquilizer, wanting to avoid undue stress or heavier drugs that might slow the cat's recovery. Hank found himself torn between eagerness to do the right thing and a pang of sadness at seeing her go. He reminded himself this was best for her, far better than remaining in a small mudroom with an old farmer ill-equipped for long-term wildlife care. Outside, Ranger Reyes set up a sturdy kennel in the bed of her truck. It was lined with straw for warmth, and Laura placed several clean towels along the sides to cushion the Bobcat's movement once she was inside. Hank hovered nearby, glancing through the open door as Laura approached the cat with the syringe. The Bobcat tensed, ears tilting back, but her depleted strength made resistance unlikely. Within minutes, her eyelids fluttered and her muscles slackened. It'll keep her calm for the drive, Laura said. Not too heavy. She should be fully alert again in a few hours. Hank nodded. Mind if I help carry her? Laura paused, meeting his gaze. Then she handed him a pair of thick gloves. Of course. Carefully. Together they lifted the Bobcat, now limp but breathing steadily, onto a soft blanket. Even sedated, her whiskers twitched at the sudden movement. Hank couldn't ignore how light she still was, a reminder of the ordeal she'd endured. Gently, they transferred her into the kennel, making sure she'd rested comfortably before securing the door. Ranger Reyes offered a polite nod, stepping away to give them space. Hank took a moment to absorb the scene, the sunlit truck bed, the Bobcat curled inside her makeshift carrier, and Laura's reassuring presence. You'll keep me updated? He asked, voice catching slightly. Absolutely, Laura promised. If all goes well, you might even visit once she's stable. But remember, we'll be limiting direct contact for her own good. She needs to remain wild. Hank agreed, understanding but still feeling a surge of protectiveness. The truck engine rumbled to life, and the kennel shifted slightly as Ranger Reyes climbed into the driver's seat. Laura rested a hand on Hank's shoulder. I'll ride with her. We'll keep her comfortable. Hank offered a final nod, stepping back. He watched the truck roll down the gravel drive until it disappeared behind the stand of trees that bordered his property. The loneliness hit him abruptly. The mudroom felt empty, stripped of that tenuous life he'd nurtured over the past days, yet he also felt a spark of gratitude. That Bobcat, once a silent figure on his porch, now had a fighting chance. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Hank tried to lose himself in chores, mending a section of fence, checking the tractor's oil, and feeding the chickens. Yet he kept imagining the Bobcat's eyes staring back at him. The memory left him unsettled and strangely restless. That evening, as he settled into his armchair with a small supper, the house felt too quiet. He knew it was for the best, but a hollow sensation in his chest reminded him how quickly he'd grown attached. Just before nightfall, the phone rang. Hank scrambled from his seat, nearly tripping over a scatter rug in his haste to answer. It was Laura. She's settling in, she said, sparing him any introduction. Sedation wore off about an hour ago. She's alert, though pretty weak. We have her in a private enclosure with a heated corner, and we're monitoring her vitals. So far, no signs of infection or hidden injuries. Hank exhaled slowly, a tension he hadn't known he was carrying draining from his shoulders. "Thank you," he murmured, "for everything." "You did all the hard work, Hank," Laura replied. "Without you, she wouldn't have stood a chance. Now we just have to see how she does over the next week or two. If she continues to gain weight, we'll run a few more tests, maybe fit her with a tracker before release. We'll see." Hank closed his eyes. The thought of her roaming free in the woods one day, healthy and fierce, brought a small smile to his lips. "That's all I can ask for," he said. They exchanged goodbyes, and the line went silent. Hank stayed by the phone for a long minute, letting the darkness of the house envelop him. He realized he felt lighter, as if a quiet but potent victory had been won under that modest roof. Though he was alone in the kitchen, he didn't feel lonely. In his mind's eye, he saw the Bobcat recovering under Laura's watchful care, the autumn wind drifting across the farmland, and a sense of renewal settled over him. During the days that followed, Hank tried to slip back into his old rhythms. He rose before sunrise, fed the chickens, checked fences, and tended to small repairs around the property. Though the Bobcat's physical presence was gone from the mudroom, she lingered in his thoughts, and every so often he'd catch himself listening for any sounds she might have made. The space heater now sat unplugged beside the box of blankets that once held her, reminders of an unexpected visitor who had come and gone. Laura called every 2 days with updates. Each time Hank heard her voice, he felt a surge of anticipation. On the 3rd day, she reported that the Bobcat, nicknamed Willow by one of the rehab assistants, had begun eating solid food with more gusto. She was still painfully thin, but she'd gained nearly a pound since arriving at the center, a small sign that her body was beginning to recover. A week later, Laura explained that Willow had started walking around her enclosure, testing her limbs and stalking small toys that mimicked prey. Those words lit a spark of hope in Hank's chest. She was reclaiming the instincts that had almost failed her before. 2 weeks passed, and each update arrived with better news. Willow's coat was looking shinier, her muscle tone was improving, and her eyes gleamed with a bright wariness whenever a keeper came near. "She's skittish, which is good," Laura told Hank over the phone. "We want her to maintain that natural fear of humans. It's a strong indicator she'll do well once she's released." At night, Hank found himself dreaming about wild creatures in his fields. Foxes, deer, even the occasional coyote crossing in moonlight. Sometimes the Bobcat would appear in his dreams, perched atop his porch railing, gazing at him with inscrutable gold eyes. He'd wake up with his heart pounding, wondering whether a sign or omen was at play. But come morning, he'd brush off the idea. He was just an old farmer whose life had been shaken up by a wounded predator. Surely his dreams were bound to reflect that unusual experience. A month after Willow's rescue, Laura called with a special request. "Hank, if you're up for a visit, I think it's time you saw her," she said, her tone buoyant. "We have a small observation window in her enclosure. It's behind mirrored glass, so she won't see you. You can watch her behave naturally without stressing her." Hank hesitated. Part of him was eager, even thrilled, to see Willow alive and thriving. But another part remembered the warnings about not letting her get too used to people. "Are you sure that's okay?" he asked. "Positive," Laura replied. "We're only letting a few people do this. You won't interact with her directly, but I believe you deserve to see how far she's come. You're the reason she's here." So, on a sunny Wednesday morning, Hank found himself driving the hour and a half to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, a place he'd never visited in all his years. It sat at the edge of a forest preserve, a low-slung building surrounded by enclosures that mimicked natural habitats for various animals in recovery. The entrance, decorated with painted silhouettes of eagles and deer, gave the place a welcoming feel. Laura greeted Hank at the reception area. She wore her usual practical attire, khaki pants, sturdy boots, and a fleece vest embroidered with the center's logo. A bright smile lit her face when she saw him. "You made it!" "I wasn't sure if I'd get lost," he joked, adjusting his hat. "Haven't driven this far from home in a while." They walked through a set of corridors lined with windows showcasing smaller enclosures. Hank caught glimpses of injured foxes, a hawk with a wrapped wing, and even a trio of orphaned raccoons. A gentle hush pervaded the air, broken occasionally by distant animal calls or the sound of running water in artificial streams. Finally, Laura led him to a hallway ending in a thick pane of mirrored glass. On the other side, he could see a natural-looking habitat, rocks, logs, and a sandy floor dotted with pine needles. A few strategically placed tree limbs allowed for climbing. Midway along the enclosure, Willow lay stretched out on a platform of rocks, eyes half closed in the midday light. Even in repose, she seemed alert, ears twitching at the slightest noise. Hank stopped short. If it weren't for the faint scars of her ordeal, thin patches on her coat where the fur hadn't fully grown back, he might not have recognized her as the half-dead creature he'd found on his porch. She appeared lithe, her muscles evident beneath a now lustrous coat patterned with dark rosettes and subtle stripes. Her gaze, though calm, flicked now and then toward the enclosure's door, as if poised to flee at the first hint of a threat. "She's beautiful," Hank murmured, pressing a calloused hand to the glass. He felt an unexpected lump in his throat. Laura nodded. "And feisty. She hisses at us if we get too close, which is exactly what we want. At feeding time, she pounces on her meals. She's strong." "How long until she's ready for release?" Hank asked quietly. "Another month, maybe 2, Laura replied. "We're waiting for her to reach a stable weight and show consistent hunting behaviors. We use live prey simulations. Once she's proven she can hunt effectively, fish and wildlife will approve her release location." Hank watched Willow lift her head at a distant noise, possibly another animal in a neighboring enclosure. She moved with elegance, turning to trot near a shallow pool of water, her tail swishing. Despite the glass barrier, Hank sensed her feral independence. It was hard to imagine this regal creature lying limp on his porch, so close to death. A fresh wave of emotion washed over him. "You know, I never thought I'd see her like this," he admitted. "That day, I honestly believed she wouldn't last the afternoon." Laura placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "But she did, thanks to you. We gave her medical care here, yes, but you were the one who kept her going when every moment counted." They lingered by the observation window for a few more minutes. Willow paced the enclosure, occasionally sniffing at the rock walls or flexing her claws on a thick branch. To Hank, each motion was a triumph of life over near-certain doom. When Willow finally settled near a sunlit patch of sand, Hank sensed this was his cue to let her be. He bid farewell to Laura, who promised to keep him in the loop about the release plans. As he walked through the center's corridors, he felt lighter than he had in years. There was something about witnessing a second chance that reinvigorated his soul. Outside, the afternoon sun glowed over the parking lot. He climbed into his truck and headed home, a certain warmth in his chest. That evening, Hank gazed out at his own property, watching dusk settle on the fields. He imagined Willow someday roaming free in a wooded hollow, perhaps miles from any farmhouse, living out her life the way she was meant to. The possibility stirred a quiet joy in him. Yes, he'd always believed in letting nature take its course, yet he'd also seen the power of compassion, how a little help could tip the scales when survival hung in the balance. A gentle breeze rustled the wheat, and Hank closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him. The recollection of Willow's lean frame prowling her enclosure burned bright in his memory. After everything she'd endured, she now stood on the threshold of a future where she could thrive. And for the first time in a long while, Hank felt he too was on the cusp of something new. A renewed faith in the resilience of living things and in his own capacity to make a difference, no matter how small. At first, the days after Hank's visit to the rehabilitation center followed a peaceful routine. He'd spend mornings in the fields, checking on the newly turned soil before winter set in, and afternoons patching up old barn doors or repairing a rusted trough. Yet each evening, he found himself replaying the moment he'd seen Willow through the observation window. Even without direct contact, the memory lingered. Her graceful stride, the sharp intelligence in her eyes. He wondered if she sensed how many people worked behind the scenes to ensure her survival. Maybe, in some primal way, she understood. Meanwhile, updates from Laura continued to filter in by phone. Willow gained weight steadily, inching closer to the healthy baseline for a female bobcat. With each passing week, she grew more adept at stalking and capturing the live prey introduced into her enclosure. The staff at the center reported that she'd even managed to subdue a swift hare, a feat requiring both patience and explosive power. Hank was always relieved to hear that Willow remained as wary of humans as ever, retreating to the far corners of her enclosure whenever anyone approached. In the realm of rehabilitation, that distrust was a mark of success. Ranger Nicole Reyes stopped by Hank's farm one Saturday afternoon, her timing coinciding with the quiet lull after lunch. Hank invited her to sit on the porch, offering a cold glass of iced tea. Nicole was friendly, sporting the same khaki uniform and clipped radio on her belt that Hank remembered from their first meeting. She came bearing news. Fish and Wildlife had approved a nearby release site for Willow. It was a stretch of rolling hills and wooded corridors about 30 miles northeast of Hank's farm, safely distant from neighborhoods but rich in small game. Willow's release date had been set for the following month. Hank listened with a respectful nod, though he couldn't hide the question in his eyes. Nicole recognized it before he spoke. "Yes, you can absolutely be there," she said with a small smile. "Laura and I both agreed you deserve a front row seat. Without you, we wouldn't be talking about releasing a healthy bobcat." Hank felt a twinge of gratitude, but also an unnameable tension. Part of him dreaded the day he'd see Willow vanish into the wild for good. He knew it was the proper conclusion, her rightful place. Still, the bond forged by that brush with mortality was difficult to let go of entirely. The news spread quietly through the local community. A few neighboring farmers, upon hearing about the plan, expressed concern. Bobcats, they argued, could threaten livestock, especially smaller animals like chickens or young goats. Hank fielded these worries with calm reassurance. Willow was a solitary predator, primarily interested in wild prey. Besides, Fish and Wildlife had selected the release site for its abundant rabbit population. Still, Hank understood their apprehension. Not everyone had seen Willow at her weakest, clinging to life in a farmhouse mudroom. Some folks only knew of bobcats through sightings at dusk or from stories that painted them as prowling dangers. As the release day approached, Hank found himself spending hours in silent reflection. He walked the perimeter of his fields, scanning the tree line where the sun dipped behind the oaks each evening. Sometimes he envisioned Willow slinking through tall grasses, her coat blending with the undergrowth. He recalled how her ribs had shown starkly beneath her skin and how that image contrasted with the healthy cat he'd witnessed at the center. In his more philosophical moments, he mused on the fragility of life, how one small act could shift the balance between death and survival. Days passed in a sort of restless anticipation, the final chapter nearing completion. On a crisp autumn morning, only a week before Willow's scheduled release, Laura invited Hank to the center again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He drove out on a Friday, arriving late in the afternoon when the golden light warmed the hills around the preserve. Upon entering, he immediately noticed a buzz of activity. Staff members bustled about with crates of supplies, some carrying tranquilizer guns, others with clipboards logging data. Laura greeted him at the door, explaining that they were preparing Willow for a routine health check, one last thorough exam before her final steps toward freedom. Hank could feel the excitement in the air. They led him to a small observation chamber, adjacent to the medical area. From behind a one-way window, he watched as Willow was carefully coaxed into a transfer crate. She growled in low protest, ears flattened against her head, though she avoided aggression. The staff moved calmly, speaking in soothing tones, ensuring the Bobcat didn't hurt herself or panic. Once secured, they lightly sedated her to perform checks on her teeth, eyes, and overall condition. Hank saw the faint outline of muscle beneath Willow's sleek coat, no hint of the starvation that once threatened her life. A wave of relief and pride washed over him. After the exam, Laura appeared on Hank's side of the window, stethoscope around her neck. A smile touched her face. She's in excellent condition. Full muscle mass restored, healthy weight, no injuries. Blood work from last week showed no underlying issues. She's ready. Hank felt a swell in his chest as Laura went on. We'll keep her quarantined for a few more days, then release her. I'll call you with the exact time. Usually we do these things at dawn, so she can explore under lower light, less human activity around. Hank nodded. The final piece of the journey was set, and he sensed that same mixture of excitement and sorrow. Back on the farm, Hank found that preparing for Willow's release weighed on his mind more than he'd anticipated. Each time he envisioned the dawn ceremony, he pictured the moment she would step from the crate, eyes scanning a world no longer bounded by wire enclosures. He could almost feel the crisp air of that morning, sense the hush that would fall when everyone gathered to watch her take her first free steps. Yet a nagging uncertainty lingered, echoing in the corners of his thoughts. Would she remember him in any vague way? Or had their bond always been a one-sided human attachment born from pity and hope? As the day drew nearer, Hank busied himself with small tasks around the farm, a half-hearted attempt to quell his restless energy. He hammered loose fence boards, repainted an old stable door, and reorganized the barn's cluttered storage space. None of it truly silenced his swirling emotions. Late in the afternoons, he would stand at the edge of his fields, watching the sunlight spill through the trees, imagining Willow's lithe form passing silently among the undergrowth. Each day that passed felt like both an ending and a beginning. Laura phoned Hank regularly, confirming final details. The release team would arrive before sunrise on a Monday. They wanted minimal disturbance, fewer distractions that might startle Willow. Hank agreed without hesitation, offering to help in any way he could. In truth, he yearned to be useful, to contribute something tangible. Yet the entire operation had been planned down to the last detail: where to park the vehicles, how to carry the crate, and how to step back once Willow emerged. In the days leading up to the release, Hank found it harder to sleep. He would lie awake with the bedside lamp glowing, flipping through old photo albums of his wife and children. Memories swirled of cattle roundups, crop failures, newborn lambs, family picnics under the cottonwoods. Each snapshot reminded him of how precarious life could be and how easily one could lose what mattered most. The image of Willow, half-starved on his porch, blurred into these recollections, forging a strange kinship between all the fragile lives he'd ever tried to protect. On the eve of the big day, Hank decided to load extra blankets in his truck, just in case the morning air proved colder than expected. He packed a thermos of coffee, a small first aid kit, and a pair of binoculars. He also tucked away an old wool hat his wife used to wear, a faded green one that had accompanied her through many winter chores. Maybe it would bring him a measure of comfort, a reminder of resilience when standing on that ridge as dawn broke. Sleep came in snatches that night, dreams filled with fleeting images of a bobcat bounding across moonlit fields. Before his alarm even rang, Hank was up, dressing in layers to guard against the morning chill. Outside, the world was a tapestry of indigo shadows. Stars glinted overhead, and the silence felt deep and reverent, as though the land itself understood that something momentous was about to happen. He started his truck, headlights carving a narrow path along the empty road, and set out with an odd flutter in his stomach. When he arrived at the release site, a remote clearing bordered by tall pines and a gently sloping hillside, he saw Laura's SUV parked off to one side. A fish and wildlife truck idled nearby. The faint glow of headlights revealed a handful of people milling about, Ranger Nicole Reyes among them, speaking quietly with another officer. Hank pulled in, killed his engine, and stepped out into the cold air. A hush enveloped everyone present. Even the slightest sound, a clink of metal crates, a shuffle of boots on gravel, seemed magnified in the pre-dawn stillness. Laura spotted Hank and waved him over, her breath visible in the frosty air. She gestured to the large, reinforced carrier in the back of the fish and wildlife truck. Inside, Willow lay cloaked in shadows, her eyes catching the faint light. Though sedated just enough to keep her calm during transport, she appeared alert, ears swiveling toward every minor noise. Hank's heart squeezed in his chest at the sight of her, remembering how close to death she'd once been. Now she was a formidable predator again, sleek and capable, moments away from reclaiming a life of wild autonomy. Ranger Reyes nodded to the group, and they began unloading the carrier with quiet efficiency. Hank held back, not wanting to interfere, but ready to offer a steady hand if needed. Two officers lifted the crate carefully, one on each side, while Laura guided them toward a designated spot near the tree line. Hank followed at a short distance, the crisp grass crackling beneath his boots. A few birds began their morning calls, faint but insistent, as a subtle glow touched the horizon. It felt as though the world was stirring to witness this final step in Willow's long recovery. They set the carrier down on a patch of level ground. Laura knelt to inspect Willow, ensuring she was calm enough for the door to be opened without panic. Meanwhile, Hank took a position slightly behind the group, heart thumping. The hush grew profound. Even the wind seemed to pause among the pines, as if nature itself respected the gravity of the moment. Then, with a careful, deliberate motion, Ranger Reyes released the latch. The crate door swung open, revealing Willow's golden eyes shining from within. For a heartbeat, she stayed still, nose twitching at the unfamiliar sense of dawn. Slowly, Willow crept forward, one paw testing the dew-slick grass. Her tail flicked in an arc as she drank in the world beyond her enclosure. Hank held his breath, unsure whether to feel exhilarated or sorrowful. Inch by inch, Willow emerged, until she stood fully in the open. She paused, scanning the surroundings, ears pivoting to catch the faint rustle of leaves. Then, as if some hidden signal prompted her, she broke into a lope, disappearing into the shadows of the pines. The only trace of her passage was a ripple in the grass and a collective gasp from those watching. A collective hush fell across the small gathering as Willow disappeared between the tree trunks. It felt like time itself had paused, the morning light spilling onto the grass in silent applause. The watchers, Ranger Reyes, Laura, and the other wildlife staff exchanged glances of relief and excitement. For all the meticulous planning, there had been no guarantee that Willow would step so calmly into her new life. Yet she had done so with the fluid grace of a creature who knew instinctively where she belonged. Hank stood back, hands trembling slightly, watching the brush sway in the bobcat's wake. The empty carrier on the ground seemed both triumphant and forlorn, a symbol of all that had led to this moment of liberation. For a few beats, no one spoke. Then Ranger Reyes exhaled, a faint smile touching her lips. "That's exactly what we wanted," she murmured. Laura nodded, squinting into the shadows where Willow had vanished. Though no one said it aloud, they all understood this was the true test, whether Willow would adapt to her environment and survive on her own, without the safety net of human care. Hank felt a knot loosen in his chest. He could almost sense the weight of all those weeks, her starvation, the frantic feeding, the cautious nursing, lift away as she rejoined the wild. The group moved slowly back toward their vehicles, the hush replaced by murmured conversation. Laura secured the now empty crate in the truck bed, explaining she'd return it to the rehabilitation center. "We'll conduct a follow-up in about a week," she told Hank, "just to scout the area. It's not invasive. We'll look for tracks or scat, maybe set up a motion-sensitive camera. We want to verify she's moving around hunting properly." Hank nodded, grateful that someone would keep a quiet watch. It soothed him to imagine glimpses of Willow's progress, even if only as ghostly images captured in the dark. Before leaving, the team paused near the trucks, where Ranger Reyes offered Hank a hand. "Thank you," she said, her tone carrying more warmth than formality. "I've seen many rescues fail because the animal never got that initial saving grace. Willow's story is different. If it weren't for you, we'd be looking at one less bobcat in the ecosystem." Hank shook her hand, feeling a faint blush tinge his cheeks. He wasn't used to praise, especially for something that seemed so obvious. A life in need was a life worth saving. As the sun climbed higher, the vehicles departed one by one, each taking a different winding path back to paved roads. Hank lingered last, standing alone in the clearing for a moment. The world felt impossibly large. A gentle breeze stirred the pines, and he imagined Willow crouched somewhere beyond, already attuned to the calls of birds and the scuttle of small prey. He closed his eyes and sent up a silent wish that she'd find the nourishment she needed, that she'd remain wary of human settlements, and that her spirit would stay as fierce as it had been when he first found her. Eventually, he climbed into his truck and headed home, passing farms and scattered woodlots that dotted the landscape. His thoughts churned with quiet reflections, how swiftly life could change, how a single decision could alter the fate of a wild creature. Back at his property, he parked near the barn and walked slowly to the porch, where the faintest memory of Willow's collapsed form flickered in his mind. The planks where she had once lain bathed in the warm afternoon light, unremarkable now, except for the profound history he carried within him. Over the next few days, Hank settled into a subdued routine. Mornings arrived with the same tasks, the same long hours out in the fields or the barn. Evenings found him tidying the house or thumbing through old postcards his children had sent from distant cities. Yet a quiet sense of fulfillment underpinned his solitude, an awareness that he had been part of something that transcended the ordinary rhythms of farm life. He did not speak much of Willow's release to neighbors. It felt like a private victory, one that words might cheapen. Laura phoned at the end of the week to relay initial findings. A motion camera placed near the clearing had caught fleeting glimpses of a bobcat, likely Willow, prowling through the undergrowth after dusk. They'd found fresh paw prints near a shallow stream, prints that matched Willow's size and stride. "She seems to be moving farther each night," Laura explained. "No signs of struggle, no evidence she's approaching people or livestock. This is as good an outcome as we could hope for at this stage." Hank thanked her, a gentle warmth spreading in his chest. After he hung up, he wandered to the porch with a mug of coffee, leaning on the railing as dusk settled. Fireflies flickered across the yard, and he watched them dance in the balmy twilight. He couldn't help imagining Willow, miles away, stalking through tall grass with that silent tread he'd glimpsed. Though he knew she likely spared no thought for the farmer who'd once fed her and kept her warm, Hank felt a kinship that defied reason. He had given her a second chance, and in a way, she had done the same for him. As autumn progressed, small shifts in the weather signaled winter's steady approach. Leaves blazed orange and gold, dropping in crisp waves that Hank raked into piles around his yard. He used the tractor to till the final stretch of farmland, preparing the soil for a season of rest. Every so often, he would receive a brief update from the rehabilitation center or the wildlife rangers, always positive, always pointing to a bobcat forging her path in the wilderness. No one had reported livestock killings or sightings near human dwellings, suggesting Willow was hunting wild game as nature intended. Occasionally, Hank's neighbors asked about the mystery cat they'd heard rumors of. He would share a measured version of events. He'd found an ailing bobcat and called a vet, who then arranged for proper rehab. Most nodded politely, though a few expressed mild disapproval of saving a predator. Hank didn't bother defending his choice. He simply tipped his hat and said something about each life having its place. Deep down, he believed it was not a matter of logic, but of empathy. Those who understood needed no explanation, and those who didn't never would. One crisp morning, a letter arrived from the Wildlife Rehab Center, stamped with an official fish and wildlife seal. Inside, Hank found a small packet of information and 2 still photographs taken from a trail camera. The first showed a bobcat's hindquarters and blurred tail bounding across a patch of ferns. The second captured Willow in a moment of poised curiosity, her head turned sideways, eyes catching the camera's flash in a bright reflection. Though the image was grainy and shadowy, Hank felt an instant recognition that made his heart beat faster. He carefully smoothed the photograph on his kitchen table, studying the way her ears were angled, the faint tuft that gave her an air of regal alertness. A short note accompanied the images, signed by Laura. "Hank, these are from last week. She looks great. Thought you'd like to see how far she's come. Thank you for all you did." Hank read the note twice, then tucked it back inside the envelope. He placed the photographs in a small wooden frame that had once held a picture of a lambing season from years prior. Now, the frame held Willow's proud silhouette, a testament to possibility in the face of despair. That evening, he found himself gazing at the framed snapshot, recalling the quiet desperation in her eyes the day he found her. What astonished him more than anything was how swiftly life could pivot from ruin to renewal. In a matter of weeks, she'd gone from a limp figure on his porch to a powerful creature roaming free. And while she would never know his name or repay his kindness in any tangible way, Hank felt that her very survival had given him a gift, a reminder of the delicate threads connecting each living thing, binding together farmer and bobcat, farmland and forest, in a tapestry both fragile and extraordinary. As the weeks gave way to the heavier chill of late autumn, Hank found his routine shifting to accommodate the reality of an impending winter. Crisp mornings turned to icy winds that whipped across the fields, scattering the last bright leaves into brittle corners along the fences. Each day, he wore an extra layer of clothing, and each night he stoked his fireplace with seasoned wood, savoring the crackle of flames as they warded off the freezing darkness. Still, something within him glowed just as warmly. The small photograph of Willow remained on his mantle, a silent testament to a life revived. Whenever his thoughts turned heavy or the loneliness of an aging farmhouse pressed down, he would glance at her striking silhouette, remembering that even in dire circumstances, hope could spark a miraculous turnaround. He sometimes caught himself thinking, if a starved predator can find the will to live, perhaps I can find my own sense of purpose in these quieter years. At dawn, he would bundle himself in a thick coat and step onto the porch, standing where Willow had once collapsed. The spot looked utterly ordinary now, just a bit of weathered wood. Yet in Hank's mind it had become sacred ground, where compassion and resilience had intersected. On a few rare occasions, he fancied he could almost see faint paw prints still pressed into the planks, though he knew that was just his imagination grappling with memories that refused to fade. Then came a day in mid-November, when Hank's phone rang unexpectedly, well before the hour he normally brewed his coffee. The caller ID showed a familiar number, Laura's. Concern rippled through him at the early timing. For a moment he feared bad news. He snatched the phone from its cradle, voice quavering as he answered. "Everything all right?" he asked immediately, skipping any greeting. Laura's voice sounded breathless, but not with alarm. Rather, it brimmed with excitement. "Hank, I hope I didn't wake you. We've just got a new set of trail cam images. You're not going to believe it. It looks like Willow may have, well, we think she might have found a mate." The words tumbled out in a rush. Hank's eyebrows shot up. A mate? Already? A swarm of questions flitted through his mind, and he nearly dropped into a kitchen chair as relief gave way to exhilaration. "How can you tell?" he asked quietly. Laura explained that 2 bobcats appeared on the camera near the same stream where Willow had been spotted. The second cat was slightly larger, likely a male. The pair had been photographed side by side, though not intimately close. Yet bobcats were known to be solitary, especially outside of mating season. Seeing 2 in proximity strongly hinted at either competition or courtship. The center's wildlife biologists believed it was the latter, given the relaxed posture both cats displayed. Hank let out a soft laugh that carried an edge of wonder. So she's truly thriving out there. He pictured Willow prowling through moonlit clearings, crossing paths with a wild companion. The very notion felt like a testament to nature's persistent drive for life. He imagined her searching for prey, forging connections with her territory. To think that, only a few months ago, she'd been languishing in his mudroom. Though the possibility made him smile, he also felt a tug of wistfulness. He realized it had been a while since he'd interacted meaningfully with another person outside of phone calls or brief visits. His adult children were busy in cities far away, juggling careers he barely understood. His wife was gone, leaving behind a quiet farmhouse and a routine that sometimes felt like going in circles. Yet Willow's story hinted at a new perspective. Perhaps it was never too late to find companionship or a renewed spark in life. Maybe the wild, unpredictable though it was, offered a model for resilience and openness to unexpected bonds. Laura offered to email him the photographs, and Hank promised to check them on his old computer, though he admitted the machine was slow as molasses. Once they hung up, he stared at the phone in his hand, a grin spreading across his face. He felt a sudden urge to share this news with someone, anyone, but the house remained silent. Instead, he chuckled to himself, then rose to make coffee, envisioning the day Willow might roam with offspring of her own. In the following weeks, the local wildlife team continued monitoring the area in low-impact ways. Occasional sightings of Willow, or at least a female bobcat matching her description, strengthened the case that she had adapted superbly. The center staff decided not to interfere further, wanting her to remain wholly wild. Hank respected that choice. If fate had granted her a companion, so be it. Let them wander free in those rolling hills, unburdened by human concerns. Winter descended in earnest. The first real snowfall coated the farmland in white, forcing Hank to trade his usual truck for a tractor fitted with a snow blade on heavier drifts. Each morning, he broke ice in the water troughs for his small brood of livestock. Even the chickens huddled inside their coop, reluctant to venture out. At night, Hank's home glowed with lamplight, a refuge amid the cold. Occasionally he'd pause to look out at the moonlit expanse, imagining Willow navigating the icy terrain with the stealth only a cat could manage. One clear December afternoon, Laura paid Hank a visit in person, bringing a stack of updated trail cam shots. He invited her to the kitchen table, where the two pored over images of a bobcat strolling across snowy paths, tail erect in casual confidence. Another shot captured a blurred shape trailing behind, presumably the male. The pair never appeared in the same frame this time, but the timestamps implied they moved together. Hank shook his head in admiration. "She's better off than a lot of folks this winter," he quipped, eyes shining with pride. Laura laughed, sipping at the tea Hank had served. "We can't guarantee survival, of course, but I've never seen a rehabilitated bobcat adapt so quickly. She's secured her territory, that's for sure. No sign of malnutrition, and if she's got a mate, that's a strong indicator of good health." Hank nodded, recalling those first precarious days when he wasn't sure if she'd last the night. Now she roamed the woodlands, poised and confident. It felt like a redemption story, one that somehow fed his own spirit. They chatted a bit longer, reminiscing about the early risks and the decisions that had led to Willow's rescue. Laura eventually headed back out, leaving Hank with the latest photos as a parting gift. He shuffled through them once more after she left, feeling something stir in his chest that went beyond pride. It was a stirring of purpose, a reminder that new chapters could unfold at any stage of life. As he placed the photos in a binder, he realized how her journey, improbable as it was, had added color and depth to his own everyday existence. That evening, he lit a fire in the hearth and sank into his armchair, cradling a steaming mug of cider. For a long while he watched the flames dance, letting the day's images swirl in his mind. He pictured Willow out there, perhaps perched on a high rock under a canopy of stars, listening for the rustle of a rabbit in the undergrowth. He pictured her with a companion, two sets of eyes gleaming in the moonlight. A new generation of bobcats might even be on the horizon. The thought warmed him more than the fire could. As winter's grip tightened, Hank spent more time indoors, the wind whistling around the old farmhouse. He busied himself with small repairs, finishing homemade quilts his wife had once started and paging through seed catalogues for spring. Whenever the hush of night surrounded him, he would pause to consider how Willow fared in the frozen woods. Days of thick snowfall turned the countryside into a stark, white expanse, but he took comfort in the knowledge that bobcats were well equipped for harsh conditions, with fur-lined paws and sharp instincts honed for survival. Outside, the land slept, awaiting warmer days. One morning, an unexpected letter arrived from Ranger Reyes. Tucked inside was a simple note stating that fresh tracks matching Willow's size had been spotted near a partially frozen creek, accompanied by smaller paw prints that hinted at a second bobcat traveling with her. Though no direct sightings confirmed it, the suggestion of a companion lingered. Hank read and reread that note, imagining a silent partnership weaving through snowy pines. The thought brightened his spirits. He found himself smiling more as he went about farm chores, and even his nearest neighbor commented that he seemed lighter on his feet. The holiday season approached, bringing short days and long nights lit by the glow of festive lights in town. Hank ventured into the small local market for supplies, noticing how people gathered in cheerful clusters, trading winter recipes and holiday plans. Though he remained polite and friendly, he found himself longing for the solitude of home, where the memory of Willow felt closer than the hum of shoppers. Occasionally he wondered if others realized that somewhere just beyond those hills, a bobcat, once near death, now prowled with fierce vitality. He had no desire for recognition. The story was enough. When Christmas Eve arrived, Hank placed a small evergreen wreath on his porch, just as his wife once did. An early snowfall coated the farmland in a powdery veil. After supper, he stood outside under the stars, which glimmered like cut glass in the cold sky. He thought of Willow, perhaps tucked beneath a rocky ledge, her breath frosting the still air. For a moment, he closed his eyes, recalling the night he first carried her into the mudroom. He whispered a soft thanks to whoever might be listening, to the forces of nature that had allowed her a second chance. Time rolled forward into January, and the world seemed locked in ice. Hank's phone rang less often, and updates about Willow dwindled to an occasional note from the rangers. They had no reason to suspect trouble. Every sign pointed to her thriving. Hank accepted this silence as a good omen. Lack of news meant no emergencies. He occupied himself by sorting his wife's old painting supplies, planning to donate them to a local school. Life took on a gentle rhythm, and in its own quiet way, the winter months became bearable, buoyed by the knowledge of Willow's presence in the wild. In early February, Hank received a phone call from Laura that made his heart pound with excitement. She'd been out collecting data and came across fresh evidence of bobcat dens in a remote hollow not far from the original release site. Though she couldn't be certain Willow was responsible, the timing and location strongly suggested it. There's signs of nesting material, and it looks like the occupant's been hunting regularly, Laura remarked, voice brimming with optimism. Hank clasped the phone tight, feeling an unexpected surge of pride. If Willow had staked a claim, it meant she was flourishing beyond all measure. Brightening days signaled the stirrings of spring. Icy streams began to thaw, and patches of green emerged beneath retreating snowdrifts. Hank walked his fields daily, planning the next season's planting. One afternoon, while inspecting a fence near the woods, he noticed fresh tracks pressed into softening ground. The paw prints were unmistakably feline, spaced in a neat line, each showing a small palm pad and 4 toe marks. A second set appeared slightly larger, almost like a shadow, following close behind. Hank's pulse quickened. He followed them for a few yards until they vanished into denser brush. His heart soared. Returning home, Hank couldn't contain his excitement. He left a voicemail for Laura, describing what he'd seen. Her reply arrived within the hour, brimming with enthusiasm. "Hank," she said, "it might be Willow and that mate of hers expanding their range. Keep an eye out, but don't follow too deep. We want them to remain undisturbed." Hank nodded at her cautious tone. He understood that intruding on a wild animal's domain could cause undue stress. Still, the discovery rekindled the awe he felt each time Willow's path crossed his own, even if indirectly. That evening, he slept more soundly than he had in months. March arrived with milder breezes, and the snow receded in earnest. Hank busied himself with turning soil, hauling supplies for the upcoming planting season, and performing needed repairs on his old tractor. Though the night still carried a chill, by day the sun felt warm on his shoulders, promising a reawakening across the land. One late afternoon, he found himself reflecting on Willow's journey, from the moment she collapsed at his porch to her triumphant escape into the pines. For the first time in a while, he felt contentment that ran deeper than mere routine. He felt part of nature's grand cycle. In early April, rumors spread that someone spotted bobcat kittens in a remote valley. Official confirmation was scarce, but Hank let himself imagine a small family bounding through hidden hollows. Whether they belonged to Willow or another bobcat hardly mattered. The knowledge that life continued, that second chances bore fruit, gave him a profound sense of peace. One morning, as he sipped his coffee and gazed at the spot on the porch where Willow once lay, he found his heart unburdened by the grief and loneliness that had haunted him for so long. A gentle smile tugged at his lips. He realized that the lines between wild and domestic, human and creature, were not as stark as he once believed. Sometimes all it took was one act of mercy and the resilience of a living soul to bridge that gap. And though Willow now lived her true life far beyond his field's edge, Hank understood she would forever remain part of his story, just as he was a small but crucial chapter in hers.